first thing they do is to go to a tutorial for learning how to code. And that's not necessarily going to help apply it very constructively to your day-to-day. So identify one thing that you will be able to fix with infrastructure as code in your environment, and then try to automate that. Make sure it's low impact, but high value.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 112, Essential Infrastructure as Code. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick.
Victor, why do you think people still want to point and click inside consoles?
Because they don't know better.
Why don't they know better? Why don't they know better?
They just finished university and nobody told them how to do it better. Or maybe because they work in a big bank that will never teach them how to do better. I don't know. I'm guessing. I don't know. You probably know the answer, right?
Well, okay. Well, I'm going to stick with the bank there for a minute. If employees are expecting their companies to teach them things, they're in the wrong place. Okay. That's a different conversation for another day. No, don't go there.
Okay.
Just leave it. We'll talk about that at some point. But why are we talking about clicking in consoles? If you've listened to us for any amount of time, you know that we just think that's a bad idea. Consoles aren't a bad idea, but clicking around in consoles to make changes is a bad idea. Would you agree with that, Victor?
Oh, yeah. I mean, consoles are good for observing something, not for operating something. I'm yet to see successful, effective, good team that knows what they are doing and they're operating something from console, especially at scale. I never saw that. Now that we have a team where we have 100 people doing the job instead of 5 people, and they're very successful at doing the job that could be done by 5 people. Yeah, I've seen that many times.
And you may be saying, okay, Darren, Victor, why are you talking about this? We've heard you talk about this before. Today we have a guest on, and it's the author of the new Manning MEAP, Manning Early Access Program. It's called the Essential, well, leave the out, Essential Infrastructure as Code, Patterns and Practices. Today we have Rosemary Wang with us. Rosemary, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How about yourselves?
We're doing good. By the way, the link to purchase the book will be down in the show notes. And guess what? You don't have to pay full price. If you want to use the code PODParadox, the number 2 and the number 0, that's PODParadox20, you'll save a nifty 40% off. And we don't get a kickback on it. That's just for you. So 40% off. Now, Rosemary, while we were preparing for this, I did read the free sections and I did get a code from Manning to download the MEAP as it exists. So full disclosure, I didn't pay for it. But in reading the code, I'm reading the book and I'm thinking, wow, this sounds very familiar to me. And I went, this looks like the Gang of Four book.
Wait,
Is that true?
Does it read like Gang of Four as well?
It does not read like Gang of Four, thankfully.
Okay.
I'm glad to hear that.
No, it does not read like Gang of Four, but structurally, it felt like Gang of Four.
Yeah.
Was that on purpose? Sort of?
Sort of. I came from ThoughtWorks, and when I first learned about software design patterns and software engineering, full disclosure, I started as a DevOps engineer. Don't know what that means still. But, it was a very system-oriented background. And software design patterns were really confusing to me. I think the first time I ever paired with a senior developer was in Java, and I was almost in tears just because it was so difficult to understand the patterns and the language and the terminology. It was really complex. And so why bother writing an infrastructure as code book with patterns very similar to, the Gang of Four design patterns? Well, in order to ground some of the principles and the patterns, I wanted to at least have some common or better known terminology, which is where some of it was borrowed from some of the software design patterns. I think there's a lot of overlap there, just a little bit different application between the two.
That is good. I was getting ready to say, at least you didn't use the A word, or at least I didn't run into it in the early access. The A word, by the way, is agile.
We don't, no, I did not use the word. I don't think it's even in the other chapters. There are more chapters, but it's not all about patterns. There are a heavy number of chapters based on practices as well, but there is no A word in there. I actually don't know why I never mentioned it. I need to probably include it in the book.
No, don't do it. Just say no. So you were talking about patterns and tooling, and usually the big one that we talk about a lot is Terraform, because it's the 800-pound gorilla for most of the time. And recently, by the way, at the time we were recording this, Terraform actually just released 1.0. Woohoo! We talked about it on a live stream recently. That's one pattern that you can see, speaking of patterns. When Hashi actually 1.0s something, that's a big deal.
Oh, yes. It is a very long decision process to do it. And as much as I love semantic versioning, the joke is that Hashi does not follow semantic versioning. And I think there is a good reason for it in some of the tooling, right? When you're working in open source, it's really hard to describe what true semantic versioning might be because you don't know what your community is using it for. And to acknowledge that a lot of people were using Terraform in production, but there was never going to be, at least in pre 1.0, there wasn't necessarily a guarantee that we would be backwards compatible all the time. Its infrastructure changed a lot in the past, I think, 6 years or so, 5-6 years. And Terraform has to reflect that change constantly. So I'm glad that we got 1.0 because it means that we have the foundations to build other extensions to other ecosystems outside of infrastructure as well.
I'm not even sure whether semantic versioning can be applied on tools like Terraform or let's say Kubernetes, right? Because both are heavily depending on ecosystems, plugins, modules, whatever you want to call. So kind of like as a user, to me, semantic versioning of the core does not really mean that much because that's not what I'm using, right? I mean, obviously I'm using core, but Terraform user really cares much more about TCP provider or whatever you are using, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not, if you try to use Terraform by itself, I'm going to be honest, there's not much in there. It's like you need a provider to really get value out of it. Otherwise, it's, for the most part, it's a binary. You could do maybe some stuff with the graphing, but other than that, there's not much you can do with.
And if you haven't figured out by listening yet, in full disclosure, Rosemary currently works for HashiCorp.
I do.
So we're just making sure, all cards on the table,
Yes.
just so. But we're not here to talk HashiCorp Corp. We're here to talk Terraform and how infrastructure as code plays out. Now, one of the things that I did read through, I was very curious. You've got Python examples to generate, help me, what am I looking for? What's the word I'm looking for? You're using Python to generate X. What is X?
Domain-specific language.
Thank you.
Terraform.
You're using Python to generate your DSLs.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because it's not like, now your examples obviously are simple. So that question is, but why are you using code to generate your DSL?
So there was some discussion overall, right, about what would someone be able to understand from an evergreen content standpoint. And HashiCorp configuration language, for example, as a domain-specific language, Terraform is based on HashiCorp configuration language, changes, right? And if we were to include code examples from a domain-specific language that's really tool-specific, then the patterns would be really difficult to re-express sometimes. The way that you apply the patterns, right, from software design is, very different in some ways than you would apply it to a domain-specific language, whether you're using Terraform or AWS CloudFormation, which is in YAML and JSON. And so at the very least, to demonstrate some of the more nuanced patterns in the book, the general perspective was, wrap it in Python, wrap it in something that is a little bit more evergreen. We can, Python 2 to Python 3, not being the exception, but Part of this was to enable someone who's either from a software development background or from a systems background to understand these patterns and be able to apply them without necessarily focusing too specifically on the tool as well as its language. So it is Python wrapped around, as Victor pointed out, HCL, HashiCorp configuration language, which does render to a Terraform JSON. But at the end of the day, the same patterns could apply to CloudFormation, whether YAML or JSON, Kubernetes YAML or JSON, any number of tools that use JSON or YAML formatting.
So as people are doing this, if they haven't done, okay, let's suspend disbelief or suspend reality for a moment. Why would people want to do infrastructure as code? I mean, you're writing the book on it, the essentials of it. Why should people be using infrastructure as code?
Because the introduction was about someone using console at an organization and pointing and clicking. And I guess the best justification for infrastructure as code, and the reason why I got into it, was I was working at a big bank. And the first change I ever had to do was on a weekend. I was going into our systems and pointing and clicking and copy pasting and standardizing all of the naming for every server in a certain percentage of our footprint, which was not fun, right? I'd rather spend my weekend doing something else, going outside for a walk, spending time with family and friends, and not inside on my machine trying to make a change and hoping that maybe I copy and pasted something correctly. And the reality is that in infrastructure, that's sometimes what you end up doing. You spend hours sitting there trying to format something, trying to redo all of the formatting or configuration for some infrastructure. And when you use infrastructure as code, it changes all of that, right? It's easy to say, let me start by automating my infrastructure, but how do you do it so that it's secure and it's resilient? And you're not just taking down your system. There's a lot of fear around using automation. So infrastructure as code puts practices and a framework around how you can automate those changes to your infrastructure while maintaining security and resiliency, as well as alleviating some of the operational burden that you would need to do. That's not to say you don't make mistakes. So there are mistakes that will be made. There are some failures from infrastructure as code as well. But the practice itself will help you collaborate with you and your team and hopefully mitigate some of those risks.
To me, that collaborate with a team is potentially most important. Maybe even more important than automation itself, right? I mean, obviously, I can automate stuff by writing a script and SSHing into a server and executing that script, right? So that can be considered just as automation as anything else. The difference is, in my head at least, is between being a superhero, superhuman, that does something and completely disregards the existence of the rest of the company, and working as part of the team. And if you're working as part of the team, the only way I can see that working is that, hey, what I did is in a shared repository, Git, whatever you want to call it, and where everybody else can work on it, right? Console means that, hey, nobody else knows what I did. That's my interpretation of you clicking something or changing the names, whatever you did in that bank, right?
I know. And the thing is, the only reason why someone knew that I went in and changed the names was that I filed a change request. And from an auditing standpoint, it's not terribly easy to audit or understand who went in and made those changes. And especially if you make conflicting changes. I mean, if you're a part of a change advisory board, how do you know who made a change and whether or not it will conflict with someone else? It's really difficult to decide and understand that. Adding things to version control and making sure you put some collaboration practices in place and a structure and a mindset around it helps you audit who made the changes, but also organize the changes and identify potential conflict.
You brought up a phrase that strikes fear into many people, and that's change advisory board. In a highly functioning organization, should such a board even exist?
Oh, such a controversial question. The number of times I get the question. I do think that change advisory boards should exist, right? It's not that every change should be reviewed by the board. It's not to say that the board itself doesn't have a purpose, but I think it is good to have a group of peers who are able to understand what is happening. Does it impact from an organizational level? Is there something we should be concerned about? I think they should exist. Now, whether or not they introduce friction or they introduce some kind of blocker to putting some new changes to production, I mean, you should try to avoid that. But I don't think At least I don't think that we should get rid of change advisory boards. I think there is a good reason to have them. You should still have some kind of peer review.
Well, I think peer review is okay, but the legacy change advisory board function is useless today.
I think that there is a difference between having mature team that knows when that it's working on something that can have significant impact, and then that something should go through special channels or have a special attention. Call it that channel, you can call it a board or whatever you want, right? And board as in terms, none of the PRs will ever get merged without my approval, and it must be me and nobody else. And I happen to be on vacations type of stuff, right? So blocker is when you have almost every rule that must be followed 100% is always ends up being a blocker. Being able to make a decision when a rule should be followed or not is a different question. Like, hey, yes, this should be reviewed by XYZ. Go. And this I just can be reviewed and merged by any of my coworkers because it's just what I do every day, right? That's the difference, whether it's a blocker or no.
Exactly. The legacy change advisory board definition does change in this paradigm, especially when you do infrastructure as code. It's in a much later chapter that's not in the MEP right now, but there are different types. There's different types of changes that you have to assess. Sometimes there are changes that you can have your team check and merge and things are fine. You can automatically merge if you have plenty of confidence in your tests. That's perfectly fine too. But so there are some changes, like if you're doing like a network BGP change, within your company, or you're doing something that involves some heavy connectivity between different clouds, on-prem, and different environments, you may not want to just leave that open-ended. You might want to communicate across your organization and ask for some more subject matter expert advice on whether or not this change could possibly disrupt something. Because it does happen. People will make changes to the network because everybody blames the network. And somehow there will now be a black hole of traffic because BGP was routed incorrectly.
You always blame the person right below you or the people below you. Never blame the people above you.
So here's a question, and you're not allowed to answer with it depends. Immutable, mutable.
I say immutable.
Okay, we can continue the interview. No need to stop it early. Cool.
I say immutable. I try to get immutable as much as I can, but I do acknowledge that immutable is very expensive, and it's not completely practical all the time for which is why it is and it depends.
Yeah, but expensive in terms of money, the time, both. Running at scale, for example, having to do some upgrade of 1,000 servers. I cannot imagine me doing it without creating a new image and instantiating 100,000 nodes instead of provisioning 1,000 nodes. I cannot imagine mutable being cheaper. And that's a hypothetical example, right?
Exactly. I think that the immutability comes in, especially with larger production systems that need to be mimicked. The number of times that someone has to, also later in the book, not in MEP, but the number of times someone has told me the cost of my testing environment is way too expensive because I've mimicked as much as I could in production. It's every time. Inevitably, I get this mention of, hey, this cost is just too much, so we have to pare it down somehow. And the number of times that someone has mentioned, I can't spin up a completely new network with a completely new set of Kubernetes clusters and it's just too expensive, has also happened too. So I try to go for immutable as much as I can, but I also recognize some folks have cost limitations as well. So it makes mutability more attractive.
Okay, I'm going to go the other direction. I'm going to say that it should be immutable all the time, regardless of cost, a hard cost, like cash cost. Because if you're mutating something, even if it's as code, so what? I don't know. Maybe I'm off too. That's fine. It's fine.
It's a funny thing. I think it's if you look at a lot of the implementation, any infrastructure as code tool though, which is really funny to me, there's this thought that it should be immutable, but you'll notice that there are a number of changes within infrastructure as code tools that are immutable. So there is a separation between changes that should be done immutably to mitigate risk and no matter the cost, but there are also changes within the tools just for speed that make it mutable. So every tool has a differentiation between the two.
So so is tagging one of those things that's a mutability type play typically, or no?
Obviously there are, and I exaggerated earlier when I said immutable everything. Obviously, kind of like that's close to impossible, right? It's enough to have a load balancer, right? That you need to update with IPs whenever a new server is added to the cluster. You're not going to kill the load balancer and create a new one. That is going to be mutable. So it's more like, as a general rule, kind of like, what do you start with? When you don't know what to do, immutable makes more sense as the default one, but it's never going to be 100%, right?
Exactly. I think and load balancer is a great example. Tagging is also a great example. There are some instances in which some resources do recreate entirely and are recreated immutably because of tagging, which is interesting. But the number of resources that you would need to update with certain attributes that can be done in place, like IP addresses for load balancer or tagging, you'll be able to identify it and try to update it in place. But immutability is a great place to start from at the very beginning. Just because it is something. Blue-green is really easy now with public cloud providers, right? And that if you want to do a blue-green deployment, creating a completely new server with the new attributes, new configuration, with the new image is a lot easier than trying to go into SSHing into a machine, typing in commands and trying to update it. So that's why I try to be as immutable as possible. And most of the time it works out. I've never brought anything down with immutability, but I have brought things down because I did make a mutable change. So
okay, that was an obvious lie, because I cannot imagine you doing anything immutably without bringing it down.
Fair point.
You might not have had downtime. Yes, I give you that.
Yes.
But
Thank
I
you.
don't know how you're going to do it without the bringing.
I stand corrected. You're right. Yes, they did go down, but there was no downtime. There we go.
So if someone's listening today and they work and live in an environment that is nothing but point and click, and their organization is considering moving towards infrastructure as code, what's the first thing they should do?
Not learn how to code. It is a big thing. Not learn how to code.
Okay. I'm all ears.
If a lot of people are very, and even I have this natural concern. Will I automate myself out of a job? And then people start going down this path of, I'm going to take learning courses for learning how to code or infrastructure as code tools. And the first thing is to step back and look at the type of changes you're making and identify what are the changes that you could probably do without, so to speak, right? You don't need to go in and point and click, right? Is it a batch change that requires IP addresses to be changed, tags to be done? Are you making these edits across a small number of, more than one, but a small number of infrastructure resources? And if that's something that you have, start by taking that and talking with your team. Understand what are the things that you can and can't do? How do you take that piece and express it in version control? At that point, then you pick your tool and you learn about all of the different kind of aspects of doing infrastructure as code with the tool. But a lot of folks who come to me and say, hey, I want to do infrastructure as code, the first thing they do is to go to a tutorial for learning how to code. And that's not necessarily going to help apply it very constructively to your day-to-day. So identify one thing that you will be able to fix with infrastructure as code in your environment, and then try to automate that. Make sure it's low impact, but high value. So for me, it was making changes to server names. I didn't need to necessarily create new servers, but the nomenclature in the inventory system, right, was really irritating. So being able to go in and identify those and changing them, right, is important, which is why the first part of the book starts more immediately with importing or migrating resources into infrastructure state, into infrastructure as code, because that's often where you start. You don't necessarily, sometimes you start completely new with new infrastructure, but other times you want to try to look for something in your existing environment to do some infrastructure as code as practice.
Actually, let me ask it this way. You're on board, your management is on board, but the rest of the team is not on board. Now you said, don't learn to code. All right, fair enough. But the people that are against it are less than 5 years out from retirement, and they just don't want to do anything. How do you answer that?
Can I retire them early? If they're 5 years from retirement,
That's the
retire them
obvious
early.
answer. That's the obvious answer, but let's assume that that's not possible to do.
It's a possibility. I've worked with a lot of folks on these teams, and to be honest, more of it is that they're just not certain, right? So usually it takes one person to say, "Hey, let's try to learn this together." It's not that we know everything, but collectively maybe we can figure some things out. So what we used to do is we used to take some time out of the day, like 30 minutes or so, and we talk about it, and we try to mob, for lack of a better word, infrastructure as code our way through something. So we'd actually sit and try to teach each other, and we try to learn. And yeah, so people were really reluctant. They didn't want to necessarily do it. But fortunately, when there's top-down buy-in, right, they'll, in some ways, a management team will, if they buy into this, right, they'll be able to structure some time or give some time to enable a team to do it. And so most of the time, it's not coming from a place that, I don't necessarily want to learn it. It's, hey, it's an unknown. There are some things that will do more bad than good. And that's something that a manager at one point told me. It's like, we don't do automation because it's too hard and it will just bring down systems constantly. And it took a long time to educate the teams to say, hey, this is okay. We were just not ideal in our practices, and we were doing it in a way that was introducing more failure than it was helping our operational burden.
I'm fully on board with that comment. I do think that there are quite a few cases where automation, be it for infrastructure, be it for, let's say, testing or many other things, is actually not a good thing. Sometimes things are in such a messed up state and so old that investment in automation might not be a good thing in the first place. If you have a 20-year, 30-year-old mainframe that nobody knows what's inside, would you really invest in automating that? Assuming that there are so many other opportunities to invest within that same organization, right?
Yeah. I did learn this when I joined ThoughtWorks. I was more of a systems person, and I joined ThoughtWorks to understand sort of software architecture, software development, and understand those practices and the theories around it. And what was really interesting was that it was not, when someone says they're going to migrate to something, to X, whether it be migrating services to public cloud, migrating to microservices, it was never a refactor. It was always a replatform. And when you have something like a mainframe that's very complicated, 20 years of different configurations, automation, various upgrades, of course, it's very risky to try to automate it or to try to update it or import it to an infrastructure as code formulation. Some people can do it very successfully, and that works really well. But if you can't, oftentimes the unfortunate answer is do a full replatform of whatever you're looking at, migrate it to something else.
I liked how you said that. Not a refactor, a replatform, which actually sounds much more scary than refactoring to me.
But it also, actually, to me, doesn't sound more scary at all, because, if you have a conversation about refactoring something that hasn't been refactored, that is very old, and being very old means actually basically that you were not refactoring it for a very, very long time, right? Kind of like, if it's legacy, it means that you're not refactoring it. That's the definition of it, right? So then, yeah, replatforming makes so much more sense to me. It's a blank statement, right? Of course, it depends from case to case. But if you let something rot for 20 years, you gave up on it, right?
Yeah, I think the proudest statement I've ever heard from one of the systems engineers I used to work with, this network switch hasn't gone down in 15 years. I was like, so does that mean it never changed? Like what? Oh, it's just, we just never rebooted it for any changes. We've never done anything to it. So it's been up for 15 years. It's got great uptime. I was like, oh no. Oh no. I don't know what's on the device anymore, but it can't be good.
That reminds me of once I heard a taxi driver telling me that I don't need to put the seatbelt, simply because he hasn't been putting seatbelt all his life and he never died. So it must be safe.
Let's not get into politics. So Rosemary, if somebody was to purchase your book and go through it, and again, it's in MEEP form right now. The first 2 chapters are out, or 3 chapters, I believe.
3, yep.
3 chapters are in MEEP. And it's scheduled to fully publish in early 2022.
Mhm.
What should they start looking for? I mean, what if they're just now new to infrastructure as code? Those first 3 chapters, by the way, I did read them, is foundational. It is essential, to use the title of the book. Understanding those things are very important. But once they get through those essentials, or the foundations, what should they expect next?
So the latter half of the book is a lot of collaboration and security and production focus, which is, I guess, surprising. So you go from foundational to, okay, you've implemented this, but you're going to start running into issues. And that's just not with you writing infrastructure as code. It's with you collaborating in your team. So we go through the very controversial discussion of feature branching versus trunk-based, which, by the way, very different approach in infrastructure in general, right? So we'll talk, that's a hint of what's to come. There's a chapter about testing. I had to dedicate a whole chapter about testing because I love it so much. And the remaining part of the book is also about security and practices and techniques to mitigating change failure in production. So there's a lot of, not to say infrastructure as code fixes or mitigates all failure in production. There are techniques you can use with infrastructure as code to help facilitate that. But sometimes even updating your infrastructure as code tools will introduce failures. And so we actually talk a little bit about how do you upgrade your infrastructure as code? How do you think about blue-green deployments, cost, security, mitigations? So it's a mixture of production as well as scale and collaboration.
Our episode previous to this one was talking about software supply chain. That's a really hot topic now. Should have always been a hot topic, by the way. How does that factor into infrastructure as code? I mean, obviously we're talking about, Terraform by itself is pretty boring. It's the providers that make it good. Well, providers are supply chain type objects. I mean, what are the risks there? I mean, obviously if you're writing JavaScript and you pulling in something in from NPM and something bad is injected there, that's obvious. But what could happen on the infrastructure side?
It's actually more accidental, and your infrastructure supply chain, so for lack of a better word, your infrastructure configuration supply chain is actually more vulnerable to accidental misconfiguration. So a good example of this is like S3 buckets. Everybody cites an Amazon S3 bucket as a problem, right? In that you can use a number of configurations to accidentally not number of configurations, but a default configuration could very easily expose the metadata service and allow someone to exploit it. So a number of the exploits that you can do from the infrastructure supply chain are usually accidental misconfigurations. And providers themselves or any plugin, right, that you use for your infrastructure as code tool, someone could inject bad code into that. So you do have to do your research. You do have to scan the provider, any plugin code you use, whether it be Helm, it could be Helm charts, right? If you're in the Kubernetes ecosystem and you have a Helm chart, someone could make a PR and add something to a Helm chart that they're not supposed to, right? It's very easy in Kubernetes to say, let me just inject something. So you do have to have those policies in place. So there is a chapter and there's a lot of discussion around policy, using policy or expressing policy as code and doing security testing, static analysis and dynamic analysis on your infrastructure configuration and live infrastructure so that you make sure that you're securing it and preventing these kinds of exploits. So make sure.
Wait, are you saying that we actually need to be doing security all the time and not just one pass while we're getting something done?
To cite a manager I used to work with, and I love this quote, we're baking security in instead of icing it on later.
Yeah. My phrase is slightly different. Baking security in instead of annoying everybody else later on.
Okay. So if you're interested in picking up Essential Infrastructure as Code, again, it is currently a MEP from Manning Publications. The link for it will be down in the show notes. Don't forget, by listening to this podcast, you can use the code PodParadox20, PodParadox, the number 2 and the number 0. You'll save 40% off. Again, first 3 chapters at time of listening are currently published. When are you expecting your next few chapters to be coming out?
Hopefully in the next month or so. I think they're going to trickle them out over the next couple months.
Couple months. So at the time of a recording, it's now June 15th. You'll be listening to this starting on, when is this? It'll be the 23rd is when this is coming out. So there may be some by the time you're listening to this, or if not, it should be showing up soon.
I have a closing question, or maybe not closing, but is this your first book, right?
It is my first book.
Did you know what you're getting into before?
I asked a lot of people, and they all told me, and I will quote a fantastic colleague of mine: don't get into a book just because you want your name on it, because it's a lot of work. And at some point, I was like, you know what? I have a lot of stuff in my brain. I needed to put it down somewhere, and I had been doing blogs before, and so I was like, all right, let's try this. It's a lot of work, but I will say it's been a lot of fun. I get to interact with so many awesome people who've given me feedback on it, and I'm very thankful that a number of people have been able to communicate with me on that.
And if you want to contact Rosemary, all of her information is going to be down in the show notes. And again, when you go purchase it at Manning, so if you want to use the code, you have to go to Manning to buy it. Pod Paradox, the number 2 and the number 0. Rosemary, thanks for hanging out with us today.
Thanks for having me.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.